Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, an adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online and released for a number of computer platforms in 1987, including MS-DOS, Amiga, Apple II, and the Atari ST, with a point-and-click remake following in 1991, and a full-on modern remake entitled Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded, releasing many years later in 2013. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 135. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, left-handed guitarist, The Bay 101, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Leisure Suit Larry. Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards is an adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online and released for a number of computer platforms in 1987, followed by a point-and-click remake in 1991, and further followed by a full-scale modern remake called Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded in 2013. Before we can talk about Leisure Suit Larry, we need to take a step further back into history to talk about the game's immediate predecessor as designed by aspiring Apple II developer Charles Benton back in 1981. Because, as we'll soon see, Leisure Suit Larry didn't burst onto the scene simply as a result of game designer Al Lowe's imagination. In fact, rather than being a true standalone title, Leisure Suit Larry is actually a remake of sorts, effectively a graphical coat of paint placed upon a decidedly more text-driven and fairly raunchy early adventure game. Our story begins with a man named Charles Benton, an aspiring software developer who back in 1981 decided that if he was going to keep up with the rapidly expanding and evolving computer market of the time, then he would need to develop some deeper skills in the common programming languages used across the industry. And around the early 80s, if you were a computer enthusiast or someone who wanted to get into the computer scene, that typically meant that you were going to purchase and hopefully learn how to use the venerable Apple II computer system. The Apple II was originally released in 1977 and was a dramatically more easy-to-use machine than nearly any computer that had preceded it, including Apple's own Apple I machine that had first hit the market 1 year earlier. Now, you might assume that being easier to use in this context meant that the system had better software, or a more user-friendly interface, or perhaps better hid the internal workings of the computer's operating system than other machines released around the same time. In this instance, though, you'd actually be overlooking a more obvious user improvement than simply having better software or quicker hardware than its predecessors. And that is the fact that the Apple II was one of the earliest computers that was actually sold as an actual assembled computer. Yes, that's right. Before the Apple II, most computers released on the home market were designed to be assembled, and in some cases even required components to be soldered by the individuals who would buy these early machines. The concept of a quote-unquote pre-built machine wasn't really a thing in the earliest days of the computer market, which by extension meant that anyone buying these early computers needed to have the technical know-how to assemble these monolithic devices into something that would hopefully boot up and work. The Apple II changed all of that, and would release on the market as a fully usable computer. All you had to do was set it up on a desk, attach the power cord, and begin using your brand new productivity device. The Apple II's relative ease of use, especially compared to the computer kits that were prevalent in the 1970s, made it so that aspiring tinkerers, software developers, and even general home users began to flock to the Apple ecosystem, which made the Apple II become one of the more popular computer platforms of the time, and in turn, the Apple II became a prime target for anyone who was hoping to make it big in the very early days of the computer software industry. Charles Benton, similar to other individuals with both an Apple II and a dream of future success, knew that in order to turn his dreams into success, he'd need to learn how to use the machine, and would, by extension, need to learn how to program using Apple's standard development toolkit, which by the time the early 80s rolled around, meant that he needed to learn how to use AppleSoft Basic. AppleSoft Basic was an early programming language that was fairly ubiquitous across the Apple computer ecosystem, despite the best efforts of other individuals like Online Systems founder Ken Williams to port other programming languages like Fortran to the machine. AppleSoft Basic was the standard at the time, and Charles Benton knew that if he wanted to pursue a career developing software for the rapidly expanding Apple II market, then he'd need to teach himself that particular software programming language. The only question was, what would Benton use as his first foray into Apple software development? He knew that he wanted to do something fun, because he wasn't interested in simply messing around with productivity-centric software as part of his self-imposed training regimen. I mean, come on, how exciting does it sound to say, I'm going to teach myself how to code, and to do that, I'm going to create a rudimentary spreadsheet program. Now look, I like spreadsheets as much as the next guy, but I would never really equate spreadsheets with the word fun, and for his part, Benton felt the same way. Instead of diving headfirst into productivity software development, Benton considered that he might be able to teach himself how to program using AppleSoft Basic by creating a simple text-based adventure game, similar in some respects to other popular adventure games of the time, like Will Crowther's incredibly influential Adventure, or Colossal Cave Adventure, depending on which version you're talking about. Benton realized that as a new Apple developer, he likely wouldn't be able to create an adventure with the depth of Crowther's classic title. But as a simple learning exercise, he didn't really need to create something with a ton of complexity. No, Benton figured that his little training project would never see the light of day, so he figured he might as well have some fun with it. Instead of imagining sweeping vistas filled with caves, ruins, and treasures, similar to most fantasy text-based adventures of the time, Benton instead came up with a much more straightforward story about a down-on-his-luck man who loved to party, but was otherwise not all that successful when it came to interacting with members of the opposite sex. It's not that the guy was a creep, it's just that he was unlucky in love, a sort of lovable loser who never said the right thing or made the right move in order to win the affections of the various beauties he desperately wanted to be with. In Benton's game, that wannabe Lothario would be tasked with finding a number of items that would hopefully allow him to woo the objects of his desire, or at a minimum, give it his best try. Whether he'd be successful or not was all up to the player and their own ability to find the objects that individual women wanted, a process that would involve solving some light puzzles along the way. Or at least, that would have been the concept for the game if Benton ever thought a player other than himself, or perhaps his friends, would ever play this game. Because, like we talked about, Benton never intended for this pseudo-dating simulator to see the light of day. It was looked at solely as a teaching tool, something he'd be able to use to teach himself how to program using AppleSoft Basic. And as such, it didn't really matter what the subject matter was, or how raunchy it might become, or how outlandish the situations in the game might be. It was truly an internal project, and one that Benton was content with never sending anywhere, other than the variety of floppy disks that he'd routinely use on his own Apple II. The thing is, though, Benton's friends, who he had allowed to play the game, actually thought it was quite good, and certainly better than its status as an internal learning project would suggest. They told Benton, point blank, that his little game was shaping up to be something that was surprisingly engaging, and interestingly enough, pretty darn funny, as Benton wasn't trying to create a lewd, X-rated kind of raunchy title. Sure, the content matter was decidedly mature, and it wasn't something Benton would want his kids to play. But the game was more focused on looking at the absurdity of really awkward encounters between a very not smooth operator and a series of women who couldn't care less about this lovable loser's attempt to win their affections, which, while definitely containing mature subject matter, was really more focused on comedy as opposed to raunch. Benton's friends really enjoyed his game, and even though Benton himself had never intended for it to be sold anywhere, his friends pleaded with him to try to self-publish the title. They really believed in the potential of his work, and while Benton wasn't entirely sure if this was the right move, he figured, what the heck? What's the worst that could happen? Let's say he goes to an industry trade show and attempts to sell his game. If it doesn't sell at all, then it's literally zero impact to him since he never intended to sell the game in the first place. But if he goes to a trade show and he does sell a couple of copies, well then great, he just made some money off of something he expected to be an internal throwaway learning experience. Realizing that there was legitimately no downside to attempting to sell the game, Benton copied the game to a bunch of floppy disks, packaged them up into plastic baggies, and set off to a local industry trade show, renting out a small space where hopefully he might be able to make some money back for the time he spent learning how to program on the Apple II. In today's computer and video game market, attempting to get noticed as a solo software developer is an almost impossible endeavor, unless you're incredibly talented or incredibly lucky, and oftentimes both. And while luck and talent certainly played a part in the early days of the computer game industry as well, the simple fact is that the potential for getting noticed by an industry heavyweight, so to speak, was much higher back then, simply because the overall pool of software developers was much smaller around that time. It didn't take quite as much back then to get your game in front of some pretty important eyeballs, and because of how limited the overall expanse of the computer and video game market was in the early 80s, your chances were much higher to potentially sell your product, assuming your product was something that others could enjoy. So, Benton is sitting at this industry trade show, and wouldn't you know it, one of the people who walked by his table was none other than Ken Williams, the co-founder of software development studio Online Systems, who just 1 year earlier had published the company's very first game, an early text and graphics adventure title designed by his wife, Roberta Williams, entitled Mystery House. Roberta Williams had been inspired by Will Crowther's adventure, and after spending several days and nights playing that title in the hopes of ferreting out all of its secrets, Williams considered that she might be able to create her own adventure game for the masses to enjoy. She went to her husband, Ken, and asked him to help her create that adventure game, because Roberta didn't have much in the way of technical expertise, though she did have a bunch of ideas for what might work well in an adventure game. Her husband, Ken, was much more technically inclined, and had a ton of experience working with and developing software for a variety of computer systems. Between the two of them, Ken and Roberta collaborated on the creation of Mystery House, which would be the first adventure game to marry on-screen graphics with the traditional text parser interface that was standard across other adventure games of the time. The difference with Mystery House was the fact that players no longer needed to imagine what the game world would look like. They'd be able to see, with their own two eyes, the world that they were exploring and interacting with, which back in 1980 was a revolutionary concept. Mystery House would pave the way for online systems to develop future graphical adventure titles as part of their high-res adventure line of games. And in just a year following Online Systems' release of Mystery House, their new style of adventure game was taking the computer world by storm. And the company's co-founder, Ken Williams, was always looking for ways to expand the company's portfolio, whether that meant developing games internally or publishing titles that he might find that he thought would be a good fit for the company's game catalog. When Williams saw Charles Benton's raunchy text-based adventure game at the industry trade show they were both randomly attending, Williams saw an opportunity. He purchased the game, returned home, and fired it up on his own Apple II machine, and within a few minutes, he knew that this was something special. He had never played a game that was quite so funny, and he ended up playing the game for 4 hours straight before he finally shut it down and decided that he wanted to work with Benton to publish this game more broadly than Benton's current approach of selling bagged floppy disks at a random trade show. Williams saw huge potential with the game, and he considered Online Systems would probably be the perfect company to bring Benton's raunchy adventure to the masses. So, Williams reached out to Benton and offered to publish his game, which was, as you might expect, a bit of a shock to the relatively new Apple II software developer. Here was an opportunity to sell his game, a project that was never intended to be seen by anyone, let alone be sold as an actual product. And now, one of the most prominent up-and-coming development studios in the industry was offering to work with him to expand the reach of his title. It seemed almost too good to be true, and it didn't take long for Benton to agree to Williams' offer. Benton's first Apple II game was going to be published by Online Systems, with the only question being how best to market that title to the still limited computer gaming market. Interestingly, in addition to Ken Williams' genius-level programming expertise, he was also a very shrewd businessman, and he knew what would draw the attention and eyes of gamers. Benton's game, like we talked about, was a somewhat mature, slightly raunchy adventure where your goal, at its most basic level, was to try to sleep with as many women as possible. Well, when you have a game that's ostensibly about sex, Ken Williams figured you better use sex to sell your product. So, in order to market Benton's forthcoming game, Williams decided to set up a photo shoot where several young women, including a topless Roberta Williams herself, would be sitting in a hot tub, seemingly beckoning gamers to play this game, while a mustachioed waiter stood in the background, drinks ready to be served to the hot tub beauties, and presumably you, should you decide to purchase this game. And of course, while a picture is worth 1,000 words, you still need to have an engaging title to sell a game to the masses. Following that risque photo shoot, Williams and Benton came up with the perfect title to market his new game. From that point on, Benton's raunchy, interactive text-based adventure would be known as Soft Porn Adventure. Now, I want to paint you a picture. You have a game called Soft Porn Adventure. The box and all related advertising features a hot tub full of naked women. You might expect, even in the pre-software ratings era of the computer game industry, that this would be a bit of a hard sell to consumers. Or, at a minimum, it might be a bit of a hard sell at retail, because there could have potentially been a bit of a stigma or potentially embarrassment associated with bringing a raunchy, mature game to the checkout line at your local computer game store. And yes, while some people didn't appreciate the overt sexualized imagery that permeated the game's advertising campaign, and Online Systems and Benton would end up getting a fair amount of hate mail from individuals who thought that the game was morally questionable, which, by the way, included Benton's own mother, that in no way had a negative impact on sales. In fact, Softporn Adventure would end up being Online Systems' biggest seller to date, with nearly a quarter of all Apple II owners purchasing a copy of the game for their own personal use. Even beyond the direct sales figures for the game, which equated to over 50,000 copies, a huge number for a 1981 computer game, Softporn Adventure would end up increasing the sales of other Online Systems games, simply because retailers who wanted in on the Softporn bandwagon didn't want to only purchase a single game from the company. That just wasn't economically sound given shipping logistics. So, in addition to ordering a ton of copies of Softporn Adventure, retailers would also order a bunch of copies of Online Systems' other games, which in the short term greatly increased the profits of the company overall, setting Online Systems up for continued growth and market dominance, a position that probably made Ken Williams smile each night as he counted virtual dollar signs before going to sleep. While Softporn Adventure was undeniably a huge reason why Williams counted dollars instead of sheep when attempting to doze off at night, Benton and his new text adventure were far from the only titles being worked on and published by the company. In fact, even in the early days of Online Systems, before it would be known as Sierra Online, Ken Williams was interested in building the company with the best and brightest talent in the industry, with a focus on hiring game designers who could bring their own personal experiences, skill sets, and personality to the games they'd end up creating. Charles Benton had certainly done that with Softporn Adventure, and in the process, he would end up joining the Online Systems team until 1985, when he would decide to go off and form his own company, Technology Systems Incorporated. Interestingly, shortly after Benton joined the company, another self-taught aspiring computer programmer would end up joining the team, who, like Benton, had a penchant for comedy and a desire to make a name for himself in the still-evolving computer game industry. That man who joined Online Systems in 1982 was none other than Al Lowe. Al Lowe didn't begin his career with the intention of becoming a computer game designer, and in fact, his primary focus from a very young age was actually music. In particular, Lowe loved playing the saxophone, both in his spare personal time as well as semi-professionally, as Lowe would join various college bands in order to continue developing his musical abilities. His love of music was so deep that after he graduated from college, Lowe decided to become a music teacher and band director at a local public school, in the hopes that he would be able to inspire the children in his classes to explore the wonderful world of music and musical performance. By all accounts, Lowe was happy with his career choice, and for 15 years, his singular focus was teaching his students and hopefully instilling the same love of music in them as what he had felt his whole life. This continued focus on music and music education would continue until one fateful day during an extended sick leave, a period of time that saw Lowe stuck at home without the ability to teach his students or play his beloved saxophone. Looking for some way to occupy his time, Lowe considered that maybe he'd try to learn a new skill. And given the rapid expansion of the personal computer market happening in the late 70s and early 80s, Lowe figured that it might make sense to learn how to use those darn machines that were starting to pop up all around the world. So Lowe sat down and decided that he would teach himself how to develop software, ostensibly as a way of keeping himself busy during his sick leave. Interestingly though, once Lowe started learning the ins and outs of programming on the venerable Apple II computer system, which, like I mentioned earlier, was pretty much the computer to have in the early days of the personal computer industry, he quickly decided that computers, and specifically game design, might prove to be an even more interesting career than music education. Following that sick leave, after which he developed some fairly impressive programming chops, it didn't take long for him to leave academia behind as he quit his job and dedicated himself to becoming a full-fledged game designer. Lowe's earliest efforts were with a company called Sunnyside Soft, where he, along with his wife Margaret and another couple, Michael and Ray Lynn McChesney, decided to begin making educational software for children. Their major claim to fame was the fact that everyone involved with the company, which from what I can tell was primarily the Lowes and the McChesneys, had all been educators in some capacity, with their company biography touting the fact that each staff member at Sunnyside Soft had over 15 years of teaching experience. The thought was that for a bunch of teachers turned computer game designers, what better way to leverage their prior career expertise than by creating educational games for children to enjoy and hopefully learn from. This focus on educational content for young children would manifest itself with the release of 3 games in 1982, Dragon's Keep, Bop-A-Bet, and Troll's Tale, all of which would be created for the Apple II and self-published by the still small Sunnyside Soft team. While none of those titles would achieve any degree of widespread acclaim, they were successful enough to gain the attention of Sierra Online co-founder and CEO Ken Williams, who had recently renamed his company from Online Systems to Sierra Online, and was in the process of attempting to expand the publishing arm of his rapidly expanding company. As part of that expansion, Williams would routinely keep an eye out for new and exciting products, as well as the talented staff behind those products, all in the hopes of building his company into a juggernaut in the computer gaming space. And interestingly enough, as Williams was looking at the latest game releases, he came upon the 3 educational titles created by Sunnyside Soft that we had just been discussing. Williams, after seeing those titles, was immediately impressed, and pretty much decided on the spot that he wanted to work with that company. Or, more accurately, Williams decided on the spot that he effectively wanted that company, and also wanted the staff that worked at the company. So he made an offer to purchase and republish those 3 titles, this time under the Sierra Online publishing label, and further made offers to the individuals who made those games to join the Sierra team. Considering Sierra was rapidly making a name for itself as an up-and-coming company in the computer industry, it didn't take long for the Lowes and the McChesneys to decide to join Sierra, effectively beginning a new career, this time under Ken Williams' overarching leadership. While Ray Lynn and Michael McChesney would end up working on a single game while at Sierra, the 6th high-res adventure release, which ended up being a licensed title based on the Dark Castle film property, Al and Margaret Lowe would become much more involved with a broader set of future Sierra titles, with Al in particular being assigned to several games shortly after he joined the team. Lowe's earliest efforts after joining the company were focused on bringing a number of Disney-licensed titles to life, after which he would have the opportunity to work on some of Sierra's most prized franchises, like the King's Quest and Police Quest series of titles. And throughout all of these opportunities, Al Lowe continued to expand his own development and game design skill set, learning from other more experienced game designers, like Roberta and Ken Williams themselves, to hopefully prepare himself for even bigger and better things in the future. While Lowe was content working on various Disney-licensed titles and Sierra franchise hits, his career would take a bit of a different turn in 1986, which is when Sierra lost the rights to create and publish games using the Disney license. This would have a direct impact on Lowe's work, as up to this point, Lowe had made a bit of a name for himself with his focus on Disney-licensed titles, and now that Sierra no longer held that lucrative license, Lowe had a bit more time on his hands to potentially work on new projects. It was around this time that Lowe recalled a prior game that Sierra had published in the early 80s, that being Charles Benton's adult-oriented text game Soft Porn Adventure. Lowe took a look at the game and realized that the core structure and framework for the game was pretty darn interesting. But at the same time, he recognized that the game itself felt as though it wasn't really representative of the quality of Sierra's other titles, and certainly wasn't reflective of the various technologies that Sierra had pioneered in the years following Soft Porn Adventure being released. Lowe reasoned that in the bigger context of Sierra's gameography, Soft Porn Adventure stood out, and not necessarily in a good way. Now recognize that Al Lowe didn't have an issue with the mature subject matter included in the title. He was more concerned with the way the game seemed to lack a defined personality, and further, he was shocked that Sierra would publish a text-only adventure game, when Sierra's major claim to fame from their earliest release, Mystery House, had been the fact that the company always wanted to exceed consumer expectations. That's why Mystery House was created with graphics in the first place, as a means of distinguishing Sierra's work from other purely text-driven affairs. And yet, despite that company-wide focus, Soft Porn Adventure, a 100% text-based adventure title, had been published by the company. While Lowe believed that this was certainly an oddity given the company's focus, he also considered that perhaps this was also an opportunity in disguise. So, Lowe gathered all of his thoughts and prepared a pitch to Sierra CEO Ken Williams, where Lowe basically made an argument that Soft Porn Adventure in its current state wasn't really reflective of the level of quality that Sierra was known for. To help combat this perception, Lowe proposed that he could, given his newfound free time, create a sort of remake to that original title, complete with then state-of-the-art graphics and technical advancements that had become commonplace in Sierra titles over the years, along with a more comedic game design philosophy that he hoped would make the game appeal to gamers around the world. Lowe conceptualized a reworked version of Soft Porn Adventure, complete with new characters, a more well-defined protagonist, who Lowe envisioned as a leisure suit-wearing lovable loser, and a fleshed-out narrative. The overall puzzles and general structure of the game would align very closely with Softporn Adventure's design, but everything else? That would be greatly expanded upon. Williams listened patiently to Lowe's pitch, and shortly after the discussion concluded, Williams gave Lowe the green light to proceed with his modernized remake of Softporn Adventure. After hearing the news that he was given the go-ahead to work on his new project, Lowe was ecstatic, and he quickly decided that he was going to put everything he had into bringing his new vision for the game to life. This determination and focus is what would eventually lead to the creation of the very first Leisure Suit Larry title, entitled Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards in 1987. Al Lowe pulled out all the stops in the creation of his new game, using the most advanced version of Sierra's Adventure Game Interpreter or AGI engine in order to bring the game to life, coupled with collaboration with a number of other Sierra game designers and programmers, like Mark Crow of Space Quest fame, and perhaps most interestingly, Ken Williams himself, who lent his own technical expertise to help program the game and all of its for-the-time advanced features. Lowe would even end up composing the music for the game, drawing on his past experience in both music education, as well as his own expertise in having played the saxophone for most of his entire life. These efforts, both on the part of Lowe directly, as well as the rest of the team working on the game, would eventually coalesce into a fully playable, engaging, funny, and above all else, fun experience, with the only question left being, how should Sierra market their new adult-oriented raunchy comedy adventure game? If you asked Ken Williams that question back in 1982, he probably would have asked his wife to get into a hot tub without a top on alongside several other women and that their picture be taken for a full-color spread in national magazines, as was the case with Softporn Adventure's advertising campaign. But the Sierra Online of 1987 was a lot different than the online systems of 1982, and over the years, Sierra had built a very family-friendly image that Williams and the rest of the leadership team didn't want to potentially tarnish with an adult-oriented title, even if that adult-oriented game focused more on comedy as opposed to overt and graphic sexuality. Al Lowe and the rest of the game's team really believed in Leisure Suit Larry, but Sierra's marketing team was very hesitant to put their full weight behind the title, which interestingly meant that when Leisure Suit Larry finally did release on the market in June of 1987, it went relatively unnoticed by the vast majority of gamers, simply because nobody even knew it existed. After the game hit store shelves, it would only end up selling 4,000 copies during its launch window, a truly paltry number in comparison to big hit Sierra titles, and some of the worst overall sales for any Sierra title ever. Even Al Lowe, who had poured his heart and soul into the title, believed that he may have wasted the last 6 months of his life, simply because of how poorly the game sold upon release. Interestingly, despite those low sales and the non-existent marketing given to the title, there were a number of people who did take notice of Leisure Suit Larry, and they weren't shy about telling Sierra how they felt about the company releasing an adult-oriented game to sit alongside such family-friendly fare as King's Quest and the various Disney titles that Al Lowe himself had previously worked on. There was a significant amount of hate mail sent to the company, and even people inside the company would end up quitting, simply because they disagreed so vehemently with the creation of Leisure Suit Larry. Many stores refused to carry the title at all, and some magazines wouldn't even recognize the game as an actual release, choosing instead to ignore the title entirely. For a period of time after Leisure Suit Larry was on the market, it seemed like the game would fall into complete and utter obscurity, a rare misstep by Sierra, and perhaps an indicator that the company wasn't quite as infallible as many fans of the time had believed. Then, however, a funny thing happened. You know how sometimes controversy can drive additional interest towards something? Well, that's exactly what started happening with Leisure Suit Larry, as more and more people kept hearing about this risque new adventure by the kings of the entire genre, Sierra Online. Curious gamers would end up acquiring the game, and once they actually sat down to play it, they realized that Leisure Suit Larry was actually pretty darn fun. This word of mouth continued to spread over the next few months, until eventually, Leisure Suit Larry's fortunes were entirely reversed. What started as a 4,000 copy misfire at release would evolve into a 250,000 copy bestseller by the end of the year, good enough to become one of Sierra's biggest hits of the time. Against all odds, Leisure Suit Larry was finally a success. As commercial performance continued to soar, critical response remained a bit mixed. Most critics recognized the game was funny, designed well, and had an engaging story and puzzles. Those same critics, though, were quick to point out that Leisure Suit Larry was also crude, offensive, and, in the eyes of many, lacking in good taste. Well, it turns out that a huge number of people wanted a title that didn't take itself all that seriously, and they wanted a game that was a bit more tasteless than the standard safe fare that permeated a good chunk of the computer game industry. And in fact, there were so many people that wanted the game that Leisure Suit Larry would become one of the most pirated games of the time. And in an anecdote I found amusing, at one point the sales of the Leisure Suit Larry hint guide actually eclipsed the number of copies that the game had sold at retail, an indicator that tons of people were playing the game, but not all of those people were actually buying the game. Regardless of how gamers were acquiring the game, the fact is that Leisure Suit Larry was a hit, and as you might expect, its success would spawn an entire series of follow-up sequels, as well as a handful of spin-offs over the years. The original Leisure Suit Larry would also be remade in 1991 to take advantage of the various technological advances that had come about over the course of the prior 4 years, including the introduction of the Sierra Creative Interpreter, or SCI engine, which included VGA graphics, a fully mouse-driven interface, and full sound card support. In the eyes of many, that version of the game would become the definitive version of the very first Leisure Suit Larry, at least until 2013, which is when Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded would be released to gamers around the world. This modern remake would feature fully revamped graphics, music, voice acting, and an expanded story, all in the hopes of both reigniting nostalgia in gamers who had played the original 25 years prior, as well as introducing the lewd antics of Larry Laffer to an entirely new generation of gamers. While I don't have sales figures for that particular release, I can say from personal experience that this version of the game was pretty darn awesome, and if you haven't had a chance to check out Reloaded, consider this your invitation to dive back into the world of Leisure Suit Larry. Lowe himself would remain with Sierra Online for over a decade after the first Leisure Suit Larry released, and would be responsible for every Leisure Suit Larry title released from 1987 through 1998, as well as being the designer behind the 2013 Reloaded edition of the title. After Lowe left Sierra in 1998, he would, for the most part, disappear from the game design scene, and would instead choose to focus on his comedy. He'd never truly dissociate from his most popular creation, and Lowe, even today, is a regular attendee at adventure game conventions, where he has the opportunity to both talk about Leisure Suit Larry, as well as perform its iconic theme with other musically inclined fans. Despite the fact that Lowe isn't active in the computer and video game industry anymore, his influence continues to be felt, and retrospective analysis has recognized that Lowe is likely one of the top adventure game designers of all time, with the original Leisure Suit Larry game being recognized as one of the best and most influential adventure games ever created. It might come as a shock to some to learn that Leisure Suit Larry continues to maintain a spot in the adventure game scene even today, with modern releases continuing the story of everyone's favorite lovable loser. The latest modern release came out back in 2020, and while it's unclear if we'll continue to see future Larry releases, the simple fact that there continues to be games made in the Leisure Suit Larry series is a testament to the game's longevity, and an indicator of just how much adventure gamers love the character. Whether we get new Leisure Suit Larry games in the future, or if his latest outing ends up being his last, the fact is that the original Leisure Suit Larry defied the odds to become a well-received and much beloved title in adventure game history, and its creator, Lowe, is oftentimes mentioned in the same breath as other adventure game design legends as being one of the best game designers of all time. In the eyes of many, Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards remains one of the funniest games they've ever had the pleasure of experiencing, and Larry Laffer has surprisingly wormed his way into the hearts of countless gamers over the years. While Larry's exploits aren't quite as epic as some other adventure game heroes with their world-saving antics, that in no way diminishes the quality of the titles in which he appears, and the very first Leisure Suit Larry in particular remains an important release in computer game history that adventure game fans will undoubtedly remember forever. are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Leisure Suit Larry in the land of the lounge lizards today versus when it was released almost 40 years ago. At its core, Leisure Suit Larry is similar in many ways to the other Sierra AGI adventure titles we've already looked at, namely King's Quest and Police Quest, which makes a ton of sense considering they all share the same underlying framework and technology. What this means is that sitting down to play Leisure Suit Larry is instantly familiar to anyone who may have played one of Sierra's other old-school adventure games, in that you have a graphical section of your display that shows the game world, with the bottom section of your screen dedicated to the text parser that represents your main way of interacting with the various objects, characters, and locations in the game world. Like other Sierra AGI titles, you can move around the game world using the arrow keys on your keyboard with a single directional press starting your character moving in a specific direction, and an additional key press stopping your character from moving. Other than directly controlling your avatar and seeing him move around the screen, all other interactions are accomplished using your text parser, where you can type various commands into the game, and assuming the game understands the words you're using, the game will carry out some action or interaction, like open door or get in car, with the corresponding action playing out in the graphical section of the screen for players to enjoy. Over the course of your adventure, you'll have an opportunity to explore a bunch of different locations, solve a fair number of different puzzles, both environmental and inventory-based, and interact with several different characters, all in your pursuit of accomplishing your in-game goal, which in the case of Leisure Suit Larry, is to find true love. Or, at a minimum, find a woman desperate enough, or with poor enough self-esteem, to actually want to sleep with Larry. In many ways, Leisure Suit Larry is just like Police Quest, King's Quest, and other AGI adventures, albeit with more of a comedic focus and a decidedly sexual coat of paint taking the place of gritty police procedures and fairy tale fantasy settings. But to assume that Leisure Suit Larry is simply a sexy version of other Quest games, or at least as sexy as a handful of pixels can be, is actually a bit of an incorrect assumption. Because, in reality, there's a lot that Leisure Suit Larry does that allows it to stand alone as separate from the rest of Sierra's AGI lineup, and in the process, the game quickly became my favorite AGI adventure that I have played to date. To understand why that is, we need to focus on the things that Leisure Suit Larry does differently than other AGI titles we've looked at, and the first stop on our sex-infused journey has to be the game's humor, which is, to put it bluntly, one of the best aspects of the entire game. Now, before we continue, I have to admit, I inhabit the body of a 43-year-old man, but I have the mentality of a 15-year-old boy, which means the comedy in Leisure Suit Larry is tailor-made to appeal to my juvenile nature, and I've got to say, I absolutely loved it. I've spoken about comedy in gaming before, and how most games, even the really funny ones, are oftentimes simply game-level funny, capable of eliciting a smile or perhaps a slight chuckle, but never reaching the comedic heights of cinema or television. Leisure Suit Larry, by contrast, is actually legitimately funny, and there were several times while playing the game that I had to restrain myself from laughing out loud, because I was playing the game across the room from my 8-year-old daughter, and I just knew that if she heard me laughing at something I was playing, she was going to walk over and ask me what was so funny, and I wasn't ready to explain Larry Laffer's exploits to her just yet, and honestly, I probably never will be. So I decided to suppress my laughter a bit, but that in no way reflects negatively on the game itself, because Leisure Suit Larry is funny. There are so many jokes laced with sexual innuendo, so many one-liners, so many comedic moments. The entire game was filled with excellent comedic writing and situations that immediately made you feel for Larry's plight at the same time as you were cringing at his behavior, and the whole thing was an intoxicating mix that made me smile the entire time I played the game. If you're easily offended by sexual and mature situations, you may not like the game nearly as much as I did, because this is one of those titles that really does leave its inhibitions at the door. But if you're up for a bit of raunchy, though not explicit, sexual comedy, Leisure Suit Larry has got you covered. Now, obviously, as a mature title, albeit one that predates any sort of software rating system, you might be wondering how the game would keep unsuspecting children or enterprising teenagers, like I once was, from playing the game. And here, the game does something that is simply ingenious. if you were playing the game in 1987, but can actually create some difficulty playing the game as a fully mature, or at least mostly mature, perhaps somewhat mature? Okay, fine. Mostly immature 40-something-year-old adult in the year 2025. When you start up the game, you're presented with a quiz of sorts that's meant to confirm with certainty that you are, in fact, old enough to play the game, with each question designed to ask the player questions that only an adult could know. And I have no doubt that an adult in 1987 would have aced all of these questions. An adult in 2025, though? Well, I'll admit, there were some questions that I simply didn't know the answer to, because the majority of these questions were relevant for the time in which the game was released, and might not make a ton of sense to someone playing the game 38 years later. Some of the questions were fairly timeless, at least if you recognized certain pop culture celebrities from the 80s, while others were actually totally foreign to me, or at least foreign enough that I couldn't pick the right answer out of 4 different multiple choice selections. Every time you start up the game, you get presented with a random set of these questions, and you have to answer 4, I believe, in order to play the game. Out of the 5 or 6 play sessions I experienced, I believe I failed the quiz twice, with the game unceremoniously telling me that I was too young to play Leisure Suit Larry. The f*** I am, you silly game. Hell, I'm actually older than Al Lowe was when he made Leisure Suit Larry in the first place. Putting aside that fact, I actually found the opening quiz to be an amusing and ingenious way of building a pseudo-age check into the title. And even though I must not be as smart as an adult from the late 80s, I still appreciated what the game's designers were trying to do here. Assuming you get past the opening quiz, you'll be dropped into the game and can begin playing, which is where you'll get your first glimpse of Larry's version of a Sierra AGI adventure, which, like I mentioned earlier, will be instantaneously familiar to anyone who has played an AGI game before. Moving around the game world and interacting with the environment and other characters works exactly like other AGI titles. But what Larry does better than those other AGI titles is the way its parser allows players to do almost anything, within reason, that they want to do in the game world. Because the text parser in Leisure Suit Larry is so much better than the parsers in other AGI adventures, and even more broadly, other text-based adventures in general, that you'll wonder why other game designers couldn't mimic the same level of quality in their titles. To explain why that is, we need to talk a bit about text parser interfaces in general, and what makes a good, and not so good, parser experience. First, though, for the uninitiated, the way text parsers work is through the use of hard-coded keyword and synonym lists that allow the underlying game engine to understand what actions and interactions a player is able to take within a game world. As a very simple example, assume that the game's designers have determined that players can look, touch, and smell objects within the game they've created. By default, if all the designers do is allow those 3 commands to be used, then players are locked into needing to use those commands with no variability. Which means if they try to type in a command other than look, touch, or smell, the computer will respond with something to the effect of, "I don't know what you're trying to do." This kind of strict interpretation applies to objects in the game world as well. Let's say, as an example, that you're in a room with a sofa, and the game's designers have defined that object simply as sofa. Well, for the player to interact with that object, then they would have to explicitly refer to it as a sofa, and nothing else. In our hypothetical example, if a player wanted to learn more about that object, he or she might type, "look at sofa," which the game would understand. But let's say a player typed something like "look at couch," or "examine sofa," or potentially "inspect couch." All 3 of those phrases, while technically the same thing as "look at sofa," would be met with an interpretation failure on the part of the game engine, because the game's designers didn't think to include multiple ways of accomplishing the same action, which could potentially lead to frustration for more creative-minded players. Most games with poor, or at least less advanced parsers, have a handful of possible commands and objects, each with a few potential synonyms that might allow for some variability in how different players might interpret a given scene or interaction. Games like King's Quest have this kind of parser, where it's just smart enough to make players believe the game engine is semi-smart, but not nearly smart enough to make players have a frustration-free experience. The parser in Leisure Suit Larry, by contrast, is so much better than that found in King's Quest that it almost isn't a fair comparison. I was able to play the entirety of Leisure Suit Larry without any friction or frustration driven by the parser, so much so that the game felt like it was entirely open-ended as to what I could do within the game world. I even tried putting in some really convoluted phrasing and commands, hoping to make the parser confused in the process, but somehow the computer still knew what I was trying to do, which was honestly very surprising. I don't think I've ever played a same-era text parser-driven game with such a degree of understanding, and I truly have to commend Lowe and the rest of the programming team on the level of depth with which they designed the game's parser. It was surprisingly impressive, especially for a nearly 40-year-old title, and it made the whole game feel more modern than it had any right feeling, especially considering nearly every other aspect of the game's design, which is much closer to what you would expect with the game in 1987. Now, I do have to clarify that the parser isn't 100% perfect, and I did find a couple of instances where the game wanted very specific phrasing in order to accomplish the action I was trying to complete. But those instances were few and far between, and for the most part, the parser worked really well for this particular game. One of the reasons I believe the parser worked so well, aside from the number of synonyms that its designers included for common commands and objects, is the fact that nearly every puzzle in the game is pretty darn logical, with very little of the trial and error moon logic that made up Sierra's earlier AGI titles. With Leisure Suit Larry, nearly every puzzle in the game made sense, at least within the context of the game world, and there wasn't really any moment where I felt like the game expected me to do something that was entirely crazy or illogical. In fact, I didn't have to resort to a guide at all during my entire playthrough, which is something I cannot say about any other AGI title I've ever played. Part of the reason for that is that I do have some familiarity with Leisure Suit Larry's puzzles, as I previously played the Reloaded remake of the title years ago, which has a number of the same puzzles and situations as the original version of the game. Even so, it's not a one-to-one comparison, and a lot of times you might look at a remaster and assume that it made the original puzzles more straightforward and easy to understand than their original incarnation. In this case, that's not what happened, as the original had the same well-designed, if not exactly obvious, puzzles and solutions, which means all the remake did was put a shiny coat of paint on an otherwise already well-made experience, which is a testament to the quality of the original Leisure Suit Larry, and just how well the game and its puzzles were designed. That being said, I should mention that there are certain situations, namely your interactions with the various women in the game, that are mostly trial and error kinds of affairs, where you have to figure out what item or items a given woman wants in order for you to have a chance with her. There are some light clues provided as to what each woman may be interested in, such as the game explaining that a certain woman might like gifts, or another woman might need some medicinal help, but these clues, in retrospect, are not necessarily the most straightforward clues to decipher. They still end up being entirely logical, but you will need to make some educated guesses in order to figure out what each woman truly desires. You'll also need to be fairly careful with some of your item usage, as this game, like many Sierra titles, does have some dead-end states that you can inadvertently walk into without realizing you've just messed up any chance of completing the game. My general word of advice here: if you perform some action and you get a message that says something to the effect of, "That item is gone forever," or "That item is now unreachable," then you probably want to reload your most recent saved game. I admit that I didn't push the boundaries of any alternatives the game might have included for some critical path kinds of items, but I did know that I didn't want to waste my time. So anytime a given action lost an item and didn't provide me with any points, I assumed I had just messed up, and I ended up reloading my game, just to play it safe. The other item, or more accurately resource, that you'll need to play it safe with is your money, which is a limited resource that you'll need to use multiple times in various situations as you play the game. It's important to note that it is possible to both lose the game entirely, as well as paint yourself into a dead-end state if you don't have enough money at your disposal. One of the reasons for that is that getting around the City of Lost Wages requires the use of an in-game taxicab service, and every time you navigate from one major location to the next, you'll need to pay the cabbie for the privilege of riding in his cab. If you end up going to a location but not having enough money to pay the cab driver for your ride, then you'll end up losing the game. Or if you end up gambling away every penny you have, you'll end up bankrupt and will similarly need to reload your latest save. Gambling, however, also has a side benefit, which is it is the only way to actually make money in the game, or at least the only way I'm aware of to make money in the game. If you visit the game's casino, you'll be presented with two options for your gambling pleasure, either blackjack or slot machines, and Leisure Suit Larry includes mini games for each that allows you to bet your hard-earned dollars and hopefully win some additional money along the way. The reality of the situation is, the best way to accumulate money in the game is simply to sit down at a slot machine, save your game, and then play a single spin. If you win, you save your game and repeat the process. If you lose, you reload your previous save and try again. While it's technically possible to play the game in a more realistic way, betting limited amounts of money in the hopes of winning more than you lose, that is entirely not an effective use of your time, and considering you'll likely have to gamble several times throughout your adventure, it pays to work smarter rather than harder here. While the gambling minigames are really only there to prolong the overall experience, I still enjoyed their inclusion, and thought that this was yet another way that Leisure Suit Larry evolved beyond its other AGI peers to deliver an experience that was unique and more varied than the games that had come before it. That being said, it's pretty darn obvious that the minigames are filler content, because if you look at Leisure Suit Larry as a holistic experience, excluding the time spent gambling, you'll realize that the whole game is fairly short, representing perhaps one of the shorter Sierra Adventure titles that I've played. In fact, I'd wager that someone who knows exactly what to do can probably complete the game in around 20 to 30 minutes, which is, to put it mildly, not that long of an experience. The interesting thing is, I don't think that's a bad thing in this case, as Leisure Suit Larry being a shorter experience actually helps it not to overstay its welcome, and makes its comedy land better than it likely would have if the game was a drawn-out, prolonged experience. It's almost analogous to movies, where more dramatic films are usually around 2 hours of length or longer, while most comedies clock in at the 90 to 100-minute mark. There's gotta be some psychological consideration at play here to help determine the optimal length of different kinds of experiences, and while I admit I have no clue what that psychological consideration might be, it certainly seems like there might be something there. Anyway, beyond managing your items and your money to avoid dead-end states, the other thing you'll want to avoid is death itself, as there are a surprising number of ways to die here. Or at least surprising when you consider that the game isn't about participating in battles, or exploring a fantasy world, or bringing criminals to justice. No, in Leisure Suit Larry, all you're trying to do is get lucky, and in the process you'll have to avoid some pretty dangerous situations, which include getting beaten up by a ruffian in an alley, falling off a fire escape to the street below, walking out into the middle of the street, and apparently into oncoming traffic, failing to wear appropriate protection when sleeping with a prostitute, and perhaps most comically, forgetting to remove said protection after the deed was done, which results in you walking around the streets with your fly open and your little Larry just flapping in the wind. The cool thing here, though, is that Leisure Suit Larry presents death as comically as the rest of the game, in that when you die, you'll be transported to the Sierra Adventure Factory, where adventure comes alive. Or more specifically, where adventure games are made and characters are regenerated after players die. This is effectively an animated cutscene that shows a new Larry Laffer being created before being thrust back up into the world, ready to tackle another adventure. The best part of this whole thing, though, is the fact that Sir Graham of the Kingdom of Daventry makes a special cameo appearance in that adventure game factory, which, considering the number of ways the King's Quest series relishes in killing its players, is a truly comical inclusion that longtime adventure gamers will undoubtedly appreciate. Beyond what we've already talked about, there are even more ways that Leisure Suit Larry sets itself apart from its peers, and we're going to talk about the more specific aspects of the game in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have a pervasive set of gameplay videos on YouTube. No, when we made a buying decision, it was based on word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Leisure Suit Larry in the land of the lounge lizards, the back of the box says, Looking for a good time? Meet Larry. He's just turned 40 and he's still single. If you can get past the glow of his Grecian formula, you can see his hairline beginning to make a hasty retreat from his forehead. Larry's leisure suit is of the highest quality, 100% man-made material, permanent press too. He wears at least 11 gold chains, and his freshly capped teeth could blind you in a bright light. Down at the singles bar, he tells the chicks, "Sure, I'm single. I got in a fight with my old lady and she threw me out." He doesn't tell them the old lady was his mom, or that he was 38 at the time. Yeah, Larry's a jerk. He's the original blind date nightmare, the kind of guy you wouldn't want your daughter to date, let alone meet. But he's also the unlikely hero of this new 3D animated adventure game from the makers of the King's Quest series. 3D equals dancing, drinking, and dames. Become the lovable nerd Larry for one fabulous night. You'll dance, you'll drink, you'll gamble. And if you play your cards right, you might even meet the girl or girls of your dreams. Leisure Suit Larry is a humorous, harmless endeavor for adults. The object of the game is to help Larry overcome his jerkisms and lose his you-know-what. It's a silly, risque romp through the single scene, and a challenging adventure game that will test your street smarts and suave sophistication. So slip into your leisure suit and venture out into the land of the lounge lizards. We guarantee it'll be a night you will never forget. A new 3D animated adventure game featuring animated characters that come alive. They walk, talk, lounge, and even ignore your best pickup lines, just like in real life. Incredible three-dimensional graphics. Move your animated Larry character in front of speeding cabs, into hot tubs, and smoothly around the disco floor. Other on-screen characters do the same, and more. Communicate using full sentence input and optional joystick. The game understands over 900 words, including some of your 4-letter favorites. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box. There's also one picture of Lowe and Mark Crow standing dangerously close to a woman and almost looking like they're looking up her skirt, which aged really well, let me tell you. And then there is a little bio blurb here that says, Lowe is a musician and former school teacher. We hired Al to keep him away from the impressionable youth of America. Mark Crow is an impressionable American youth who got the idea for his graphics from a dirty old man and former school teacher. Mark and Al have previously worked together on the King's Quest series and other products too pure to name here. And that is the back of the box for Leisure Suit Larry, and I've got to say, yep, the box sells me on the title. Yes, the humor is a little juvenile, and yes, it's a little over the top, but like I mentioned earlier, it actually appeals to my immature self, so I actually enjoyed the back of the box. I do think it probably could have been made a little bit better. It was maybe just a little bit, I don't know, too tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't like it was risque or really raunchy or anything like that. I just felt like maybe it was a little bit too childish in some ways, yet trying to be an adult adventure game. Overall, though, I did enjoy the back of the box. I thought it had a lot of personality, and it almost was its own personality, which is not something you can say for a lot of game boxes just in general, or game boxes that we've looked at over the years. Still, definitely an interesting box, and one that I would definitely have on my shelf. We're going to move on now to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Leisure Suit Larry are very similar to those found in other AGI adventures, with a fairly limited color palette that maybe displays 16 colors on the screen at any point in time, and characters that are composed of a very small number of pixels, especially in comparison to later adventure titles. Despite those limitations, though, Leisure Suit Larry looks really good, with a ton of detail in each and every environment, and in what I thought was a nice touch, the inclusion of several background animations that serve to make the game feel even more alive than it otherwise would. Think, for example, of something like a failing neon sign, where one or two of the letters on that sign flash on and off. That kind of environmental detail is prevalent throughout Leisure Suit Larry, and it makes the game world feel more real and more interesting than other games that might feature more static environments and backgrounds. It's not like the level of detail here is crazy, but it doesn't matter. Those simple inclusions do more to make the graphics feel more advanced, despite their limitations, than a higher resolution display would. And I loved the overall art design in the title, as everything looked like it should, and there was never a question in my mind as to what a given object or item was, which is something I cannot say about a lot of other older school adventure titles that I've played. Character designs, meanwhile, are detailed enough to convey some semblance of emotion, but not detailed enough to really resemble a fully featured human being. Though even here, the game exceeded my expectations, as the various women that you could potentially pursue all have a full-screen animated sequence where you can, in the game's words, make and maintain eye contact with each of the women. This view of these individual characters is very similar to the full-screen character portraits that were prevalent in The Secret of Monkey Island, in particular during the Scum Bar sequence, and I appreciated the inclusion of similar full-screen portraits here in Leisure Suit Larry. Animations, meanwhile, are all about as detailed as you would expect for a mid to late 80s adventure title, which is to say, the animations are detailed enough to understand what your character and others are doing, which is really all you can ask for in a game from this era of gaming. Overall, the visuals here are really nicely done, and I have very little to complain about. Nice job all around by the game's art team. Moving on to the sound and music, unlike most AGI adventures, Leisure Suit Larry features a fair amount of music throughout the game, from its iconic title theme to some interlude kinds of pieces that play at various points of your playthrough, to a loving chiptune rendition of Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender, which plays, of course, at a wedding chapel that could just have easily been at home on a real-world Las Vegas street corner. I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of music that was included here, and while the game wouldn't have nearly as much music as future adventure titles, it was still objectively more full-featured than other similar era adventure games, and I loved the fact that the game wasn't as silent as many of its peers. That being said, Leisure Suit Larry is still from an era of gaming where game music was made up of beeps and bloops played through your integrated computer speaker, as opposed to music composed for playback on more advanced, synthesis-based sound cards. What this means is that the technical aspects of the game's soundtrack, like the instrument quality and number of polyphonic notes, isn't even a consideration, because none of that stuff existed in any sort of capacity when Larry was made. Despite that though, the music is still well made, and common songs that the game recreates in chiptune form all sounded like their real-world counterparts, which from my perspective was a nice touch. Overall, I don't have any real complaints about the audio here. Would I have wished for a more full-featured, rich soundtrack? Absolutely. But that's just not something that was possible during the era that Leisure Suit Larry was created in, so it's ultimately a wish that, at the end of the day, is simply unrealistic. All that said, I did include some of the music from various remakes and remasters here in this episode of the podcast, simply to demonstrate just how far video game music evolved over the years, which is itself a topic that I find incredibly interesting. We won't dive any deeper into computer game audio right now, but if anyone wants to exchange notes or discuss further, definitely let me know. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Leisure Suit Larry, you play as lovable loser Larry Laffer, a leisure suit-clad bozo who's trying to accomplish some fairly simple goals. He wants to lose his virginity, and he wants to find true love. With both of those goals in mind, Larry decides that his best course of action is to travel to a version of Sin City itself, known in the game as Lost Wages, in order to find the woman, or women, of his dreams, and hopefully make sweet, sweet love to one or more of them. The odds are stacked against Larry, though, because he is not a smooth talker, nor is he someone with a physical appearance that would be described by the opposite sex as attractive. But, despite Larry's challenges, his confidence has never wavered. He knows he can score big time tonight. He just needs a little help from you, the player, in order to truly go all the way. I've got to admit, I loved the immaturity of this story, and like I mentioned earlier, the entire experience is filled with comedic writing and situations that made me smile the whole time I played the game. Is this the deepest narrative I've ever played? No, absolutely not. Is this the best adventure game story I've ever experienced? No, not even close. But is it a uniquely immature, slightly raunchy, overwhelmingly funny experience? Yes, it absolutely is, and it is something that I personally appreciated. Like I mentioned before, if your mental age is older than my teenage brain, you might not find quite as much humor here as I did. But if you can turn the more mature aspects of your brain off for a couple hours, I truly think you'll find a lot to like with Larry Laffer's various exploits. Moving on to the playability and controls, there really isn't a whole lot more to talk about here than what we've already discussed, especially when taken in combination with the other AGI adventure episodes we've covered previously. The main concept I want to get across to everyone, though, is the fact that this is by far my favorite AGI adventure game that I've played, at least out of those I've personally experienced, and despite the limitations of the underlying technology, the game itself is surprisingly user-friendly, and in some ways even shows some modern design sensibilities that exceeded every expectation I had for the title. I was pleasantly surprised by how good the game felt to play, and how well crafted the various puzzles, plot points, and overall design of the title were. When I started playing, I assumed Leisure Suit Larry would simply be a raunchy, more comical, less fantasy-driven version of King's Quest. The reality, though, is that Leisure Suit Larry is so much more, and is truly a quality adventure experience, despite its age, and despite the advances that would be made in the adventure game genre in later years. It is, quite simply, a classic. So what is our verdict on Leisure Suit Larry? Well, I have to confess something. I never expected to love the original iteration of Leisure Suit Larry as much as I did. I assumed it'd be a solid golden oldie, similar to other AGI titles that we've discussed, and would be one whose age would be a bit of an impediment to a higher ranking. After playing Leisure Suit Larry, though, I walked away with an entirely different perspective, as it defies its age and the technology it's built upon to deliver a light and engaging adventure game experience that I truly believe fans of the genre should experience for themselves. It's definitely not the deepest adventure ever made, but for a raunchy comedy, it's pretty much perfect. Which is why, for me, Leisure Suit Larry has just become the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming. I know I've said it before, but this one really surprised me and exceeded every expectation I had going into my playthrough. If you can only pick a single AGI title to play, I'd recommend unequivocally that you choose Leisure Suit Larry. It is truly that good, and is therefore a surefire and immediate inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Wipeout, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Wipeout. Until then, remember, Sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.